Jai Sai Ram. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, welcome to this week's episode of Sai Karuna Talks. We are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Phil Gosselin. Dr. Gosselin is currently the chairperson for Zone 1 of the Sathya International Organization. Zone 1 comprises the English and Dutch-speaking countries of the Western Hemisphere. He is also co-chair of the International Organization's Archive Committee. Dr. Gosselin has been a past USA Sai Organization Central Coordinator and Central Council President. He is one of the original USA Central Council members announced at the 1975 World Conference in Sai's presence. He had the great fortune to live in Prasanthi Nilayam from 1971 to 1972, and again from 1974 to 1975. Dr. Gosselin is also a founding member of several Sai centers in Northeast America, including the Sathya Sai Center of Manhattan. Dr. Gosselin resides in Amherst, Massachusetts, where he is a clinical psychologist in private practice. He has previously been a professor of psychology at Union Institute and also the director of the Behavioral Medicine Department at Franklin Medical Center in Greenfield, Massachusetts. He previously worked on Wall Street for 12 years in the 1970s and 80s. An account of his professional life on Wall Street is described in the book, The Dharmic Challenge. On behalf of our UK devotees, we welcome Dr. Gosselin to share his personal experiences of Sathya Sai with us. Jai Sai Ram.
Om Sai Ram to everyone. I'm very, very happy to be with you here today on this most auspicious day. This is, I believe, in the UK, Father's Day. It's also Father's Day here in the US. And we're dear brothers and sisters. We are brothers and sisters because we all have the same father and our own Sathya Sai. And Swami used to say, there's only one gent, all the rest are ladies. In other words, God is the head of this household and the rest of us are helping and trying to be united with him. And just as we have the picture of Krishna with the 16,000 gopis, it's like that for us, perhaps 16 million, who knows, that have that urge and that want and desire to be unified with Sathya Sai. So this is also an auspicious day, and it's the first full day of summer, the first longest day of the year. And I'm happy to be sharing it here with you. I have a series of slides which I have made up in the past for the International Archive Committee, and I wanted to share them with you because since you're a captive audience, I have my own agenda about promoting the Archive Committee and its interest. I'm hoping it will increase interest around the world, but I'll also use the slides as sort of a jumping off point to share some personal experiences with Sathya Sai. So let's see. So this first slide right here. I'm advising you to garner and treasure all the grace and all the bliss you can, well you may, so that you can sustain yourselves ruminating on the sweetness of the memories and the experience. It's from Sathya Sai Speaks. And I have this here to say that this is what Sathya Sai is telling us. And next slide. Next slide, please. And this is the idea in corporate America, and probably international corporate life, is that data is very, very important. And that if we can mine deeply in the data, we're going to learn more. And this is sort of perhaps a ridiculous way to speak about Sathya Sai, but in a sense, it really says he's given us so much. There are 100 volumes of Sai's writings. There are so many millions of interactions. There are so many stories about Sathya Sai. This is all data for us. And if we dig deeply in it, we have been given all that we ever really need. And we just need to dig into it more deeply. And I combine this with this photo here. This shows how casual darshan used to be. A little bit, someone's doing a little bit of everything. And you see the little boy down below looking up at Swami. I particularly like this. Of course, I may be biased because it's my son. This is about 40 years ago. So next slide, please. And here is again Shirdi Sai, quoted in the Satcharita in much the same vein. If my leelas are recorded, a video will vanish, and if they are attentively and devoutly listened to, consciousness of worldly existence will abate, and strong waves of devotion and love will rise up, and if one dives deep into my leelas, one would get precious knowledge. So I'm hoping this applies to all of us. We should be on the lookout, I believe, at every moment to hear about the leelas of Sathya Sai. Thank you. Let's have the next slide. The nectar of your words. This is from the Srimad Bhagavatam. So in other words, this idea has been around for eons. The nectar of your words and the description of your activities are the life and soul of those suffering in this material world. These narrations eradicate one's sinful reactions. So it brings to mind, Valmiki was the compiler of the story of Rama. And he himself started out as a robber and a very bad boy. And God raised him up and made him the, you might say, archivist, the ultimate archivist of the Rama era. And we may not be of the same spiritual quality as Valmiki, but we should all strive to be little Valmikis. We have interactions with Swami, or we have spoken with people who have interactions with Swami, and if we record them, it becomes part of us. It's a way of sort of making it part of our life. So next slide, please. And you all know about the 9 paths of devotion, and people often ask, well, what kind of sadhana should I do? And so it was laid out eons ago. Here are these various types of sadhana, and that when we're devoted to God, these are different ways of opening ourselves to God. And 2 of these paths seem particularly relevant when we think about archiving about the interactions that the devotees had with Sathya Sai. One is Shravanam, hearing about God. These are the important events in life, events that transform the individual. And also, next slide. These quotes, by the way, are all from Sathya Sai. I don't know, from Sai Speaks. I don't know if that's covered up here. So people often come and they want to ask Swami for some elaborate sadhana. They want some secret mantra. They want some special spiritual experience. And his answer is, no regimen of exhausting sadhana is prescribed. Smaranam is enough. In other words, if we recollect and remember Swami enough, then the rest takes care of itself. And this is says here, the surest means of mastering the wiles of the mind. In other words, the mind's jumping around all over the place. But if we find something that's much more interesting, much more compelling than the rest of our life, it can come and live there. And if we nurture it and develop it, it can take over and calm our mind and soothe it and make it peaceful. And even in the end, unite it with God. Next slide, please. And again, this is from Sai Speaks. Listen and ruminate over the stories of the great, so that their ideals may be imprinted on your heart. And next to it's a photo that my brother-in-law took from from 1972, I believe. And next slide, please. And this is the tag. Wait, I'm sorry, go back one. Yes, so this was the tagline that I wanted you to see there. So if listening and ruminating imprints this on our heart, it's even better if we took part in those stories or we heard directly from the people who live them. So this is kind of important about these stories. It's wonderful if this story happened to you in particular, but these stories are so infinite, they're not contained just for that person. Telling them and reliving them and understanding them is almost as good as being there, maybe as good as being there. So Jesus said, for instance, those who believe without having seen are very blessed. And in a sense, those that didn't have the personal interactions with Sathya Sai, if they dive deep into the experiences that are presented, if they dive deep into the memories of Sathya Sai, it's the same as being with Sathya Sai. There's a recent quote from one of Swami's letters. It said, "Verily, remembrance is the same as darshan itself." So we're going to highlight that. I didn't have time to put that in the slide, but I wanted to emphasize that. Next slide, please. So the Archive Committee is saying that this kind of activity of interviewing other devotees, of consolidating the aspects of Sathya Sai for future generations, this is good for us personally, because it focuses us on Sathya Sai. It also clarifies our memories before they disappear. And it's also good for the person's family. This is very compelling for their family. For, when they're long gone, people will be able to remember, yes, here was direct contact with Sathya Sai, and here's what our family member said, and it's part of our family patrimony. And it's also good at the center level. The center should be taking pride in the people's personal interactions with Sathya Sai. And on top of that, it should be valuable at the regional and at the national level. It should be part of the national pride. So for instance, in a number of countries, I'm thinking of Australia and New Zealand and Malaysia, along with their national website and their national devotion programs, they have tucked in there very strategically interviews with the devotees, and you can take part, you can listen to those and see them, and they're available to all. And it's also valuable internationally. We're going to have an archive. So if these interactions are recorded and saved at all of these different levels, this means that it won't be lost for the future. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. And so this is the particulars of what we're encouraging people to archive. Most important probably would be the audio, video, or written histories of devotees, particularly the older ones, because otherwise the opportunity might be lost. But this project, you might think of it as a 50-year project until every devotee has been had a chance to say about their interaction with Swami. Not everyone will want to do it, but many will feel that this is a way of remembering Swami and passing on the blessings that Swami had given them. Second was testimonies of direct personal interactions with Sathya Sai to document the way in which he shared his love, was an example, and taught in so many ways. Now, also, we're looking for people to be on the lookout for rare photos and films before they degrade and are lost. This is kind of obvious. The archive building in Puttaparthi, some of you may have had the good fortune to see it, or some of you have seen photos of it. It's like a giant pyramid. It's relatively new building. The last few years, the Vice President of India opened it several years ago. And it seems to float on the ridge above the ashram, along with the museum building and the school administrative building. And it's quite lovely. And inside is it's not open to the public because they're trying to preserve the 7,000 pages of Swami's literal writings. It's housed in inert gases of nitrogen and argon, so they don't degrade and are available for scholars in the future. And along with that, they have preserved many films and many photos. I don't remember how many hundreds of thousands of photos or whatever. So this is a spectacular job that they've done. But even with 30 people working full time there, they're just scratching the surface. So we're giving a chance for devotees all over the world to dig deep, to find these materials, and that we can archive them internationally. Along with this, we're talking about possibly archiving museum-worthy pieces. You know, some gifts from Swami, letters, for instance. We have a variety of letters in the US from Swami to Jack Hislop and Charles Penn and Elsie Cowan, and some special displays of materialized objects and things like that. And I'll tell more about that in the future. Another thing to archive is documenting the early development of the national Sathya Sai organizations. This has been done a lot in South America and other countries also. Next slide, please. And this is just about interviews. When we interview someone, they may be a little bit skittish because they think, well, how can I tell about my whole experience with Sathya Sai in an interview? It would have to be perfect, and it would have to be something that I would just have to be geared up to be at that right moment to tell everything. And then they shy away, think, well, it can't be perfect, so why do it? But really, when someone speaks to us in an interview about their interaction with Sathya Sai, we're just getting the tip of the iceberg. And so we shouldn't worry about not getting everything at once, and we should be able to go back and dig deeper into it, find out more, what other stories or what other things have happened in the interaction with Sathya Sai since then. And next slide, please. So here are some photos from when I first arrived in Puttaparthi. I was in Whitefield the spring of 1971, and we first arrived in Puttaparthi, I believe, in May of 71. And this shows just the hilltop above the meditation tree. And you can see how sparse the land was. And in the Kasturi's books about Sathya Sai, he said that Puttaparthi had been cursed in the past. The legend was it was cursed that someone had done something wrong and by killing the cobras, and then the cobras all took up residence in these giant anthills, and that the farming was pretty much impossible, and it just become a rocky, desolate landscape. Well, when we came, it looked like something out of the Bible. You were there, and you were thousands of years from, from modern day. As Arnold Schulman writes about, he arrives in Puttaparthi in a taxi in 1969, and he said he arrived, and it was Puttaparthi was 5 minutes past the Stone Age. And clearly so much has happened that many people haven't had the experience of seeing this. This is now all covered with forest. And as it originally was 100 years ago, at the time in which, the British used to hunt tigers, and, the famous story about the tiger skin, the British shot a tiger, and but then their car stalled and they couldn't get back, and their Jeep was needed repair, and no one could repair. And finally someone said, you need to speak to Sathya Sai. And they came to him, and sure enough, he fixed their Jeep miraculously, but he told them, you've killed the mother tiger, and now you have to go back and get the cubs and take them to a zoo because no one can look after them. And in in honor of what he had done, they sent back the mother tiger skin, which is the skin that you often see under Swami's chair in the mandir. So this scene above the hillside, when we were first there, we had no rooms. We were just sleeping on people's porches. There were just a few thatched hut kind of arrangements, and there were just a one-story cell block with a few residents behind with just a very tiny little porch in front. And so at night, we used to sometimes sleep on the hill here or sleep under the meditation tree. And it was just catch as catch can. There was no plumbing. And so everything was just way out there in the middle of nowhere. And it was so lovely because you could see Swami different times of the day. You could see, if you wanted to, you could watch him go across the upper stairs to his breakfast room, or when he was going for lunch, and you would sometimes be there by yourself. You were just standing below in the darshan area, looking up at Swami, and he might look down at you or he might not. And we could sleep right next to Swami's door. It was all very, very lovely, and you would see Swami playing with Sai Gita, and it was just a wonderful, magical time. Next slide, please. And again, this is from that same era. It shows like what downtown Puttaparthi looked like in 1971. This is where you see in the center, there's sort of a blue banner there. That's where the Gopuram is now. And this shows what the shops look like then. They were basically just a collection of thatch and bamboo mats. And, you know, to get a shower in Puttaparthi at the time, you had to go to one of the bathhouses here, which would look just like one of these, might be there. And in it, you would pay a penny for a bucket of cold water, or 2 pennies if you wanted to splurge on hot water. And you would take your shower there, as, you know, it would be sort of covering up to your shoulders, but you would be looking out and the world would be looking at you as the water buffalo walked by and the people stroll by. It was different, very, very different, that's for sure. Next slide, please. So amongst the things, the most valuable things that we're trying to archive, of course, are the letters from Sathya Sai. And there have been several volumes of Swami's letters to students, and there are letters to well-known spiritual personalities such as Jack Hislop and Charles Penn and people like that. And we should be on the lookout to see if there are any such letters around. And if people would allow us to photograph those, that would be wonderful. And if they should ever need a place to archive and preserve those, we would do our best to provide the security and make the necessary arrangements. So this letter I'm featuring right here is to an Argentinian devotee in 1951. So this is really quite amazing. This lady came with her son to India she's obviously quite a dedicated spiritual aspirant. And Swami met with her and obviously interacted with her. And this letter has such a quality of intimacy to it that I very much wanted to share it with you all. Let me read it if I might. Dearest Mamita and Ramu, fling all your cares and burdens. Do not be doubtful about your path, for the path wakes up of itself under the dancing steps of freedom. I am happy to receive all your letters. You had written me that you were going to Bombay. That's why I did not write to you all these days. Wherever and whatever you may be, in your moments of suffering and joy alike, you think of me, I know. You too know that I am always with you as the life of your life. I am aware of the sufferings you are undergoing, not because of any sin or mistakes on your part, but because of the inhumaneness of the humanity in the midst of which you are living. I make my beloved ones tread the path of suffering to reach me. If I may insert here, that's a tough line to hear for all of us, but we're all candidates for suffering in this life, unfortunately. But fortunately, there's a meaning to it. And that far overshadows whatever pain of the suffering there is. Okay, that's enough of my editorial. Back to Swami's letter. Next slide, please. Well, Mamita, in a way, I'm sorry to know that you are leaving for your country. You have left your people, your wealth, everything, and you have come to India in search of the path that leads you to God. You have left the material world, the material wealth to know the spiritual one, and you have come down to India. But I fear that India has given you less than what you deserve. And now you are returning to your country, your dreams half realized and half broken. Yes, Mamita, I also want to see you before you leave India. Let me know when you intend to leave for your country so I may go down to Bangalore to give you darshan and bless you with peace. So what a blessing to have Sathya Sai say he will travel to you, to be with you, to comfort you. And clearly here's someone who had given everything towards uniting with God, and God is responding. Next slide, please. So again, I just wanted to highlight some experiences from around the world just to give you a sense that this is happening all over the world. Next slide, please. So this is a lingam, a healing lingam that was given to a friend of mine in upstate New York in the USA. And my friend was an astronomer, and Swami had invited him to speak give some lectures on astronomy at the university. And I had known this fellow from years before. We spent a long time together in India. And but after these lectures on astronomy, Swami gave him an interview, and he materialized this lingam for him. And he said, if you pour water over this lingam and you give this water to people that are ill, it will help their healing. So he went back, he took this back, and without mentioning, without any publicity, whatever, lots of people started coming to see him. And he would give them the healing water, and they reported that wonderful things happened. And it became more and more of a scene, actually, in which a lot of people came, and there were requests at all different hours and things like that. And so finally, one day, his wife had this thought, oh, Swami, so many people are coming, and it's such a big thing. Should you have given this to us? Maybe you shouldn't have given this to us. So that summer, they went away to out west. He was teaching out west, and they rented their house out. But they put this lingam, they hid it way away in a safe place. And but when they came back, it was gone. And so they quizzed the family. And they asked them, did you take it? Did anyone see it? Did anything happen? And the family swore, no, definitely not. Nothing happened. We never saw it. So anyway. So then my friend, over the years, 20 years follow. And all in those 20 years, he keeps asking me, do you think Swami took the lingam? Do you think it's because I did this wrong thing? Do you think it's because this or that? And so this lingam, in a way, was Swami's gift to him about self-inquiry. He had to inquire. This lingam had become part of his life in a way. And the missing lingam meant there's a missing link to divinity for him. And he had to sort of dig deep into himself. What is that missing link? What is the meaning here? So one day, as he called and told me, this is 20 years later, the fellow who had rented the house called him and said his daughter, who was 10 at the time they rented the house, is now getting married. And she was moving out of the house. And before she got married, she wanted to tell her father that she took this lingam and that she gave it to the father, and the father immediately called my friend. And there was talk about my friend driving way down to get it, and it's looked to be too difficult. So eventually they sent it to him by Federal Express overnight. And I used to tease him, the Federal Express logo is if you absolutely have to have it overnight. So I used to tease him that if you absolutely have to have this lingam overnight, Federal Express will send it to you. So it's just an example of something that has a long story to it and a deep meaning story to it, but one that's also of interest to all of us. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is, it says Germany on the top, but actually it's young Westerners. There are a couple from UK there, as a matter of fact. This fellow is from UK, and let's see, there are a couple of others in there. But, and this fellow is from Germany, and he's former NCP for Germany. And as a matter of fact, this celebration was 1970 Dasara, October of 70. And at that time, young Westerners were very much in favor with Swami. And he was sort of playing. He would have the tailor make them all suits and have them learn bhajans and things like that. Unfortunately, I got there several months later. And Swami was still meeting with us in side sheds and for sort of afternoon bhajans sometimes. And it was really some quite miraculous things happened. But this was on stage. And Swami was sort of, well, anyway, he was sort of teasing the Indians a little bit. Sometimes you know how he will say to one person, oh, why can't you be more like this person? And then to the other person, he'd say, well, why can't you be more like that person? So he uses everything as a way of teaching. And so in this, he would give speeches to the Indians, say, see, these people have come from so far, they've given up everything. And, you know, it's sort of, what have you given up, really? You know, you just come here for the day or whatever, is on a little trip. But it was a lovely time, a magical time. And we've had a chance to interview a number of those people sitting on the stage there. And as a matter of fact, just in this last year, we had the 50th reunion of that group of devotees and had further interviews there. Next slide, please. So again, this is just an example of, you know, beautiful objects that Swami gave that have intense meaning for the devotee and for the country that they're from. And again, that it's sort of uplifting to see. Next slide, please. And again, this is again an acquaintance of mine, and we again have his interviews. And this is, he was a well-known artist. And this is a photo taken of Swami at Dharmakshetra in Christmas 1970. And this fellow had made this beautiful artwork of the birth of Christ, and it's made out of flower petals. And you can see definite talent there. And sort of a beautiful moment that was very special. Next slide, please. And the same artist did the very large murals in the grand staircase, the main building of the Anantapur Girls College. And this was made just before the Girls College opened in July of 1971, Guru Purnima of 1971. And here's Swami on the staircase in front of one of the murals. And there's one of Dick Bach's films, which has this moment in it. And I think he took this still from that film. And you see Swami sort of looking very sweet and laughing and playing with the devotees. Very, very beautiful moments to it. And there were things about that interaction at Anantapur College which had big meaning for me. A friend and I were, as just before the college opened, and of course it miraculously came together in the last few days. You know, it looked like it was way hardly ready to be opened. And then I think some of it was the magical touch of Sathya Sai. Things happened, but he allowed us to take part. And so one day, my friend and I were whitewashing one of the walls, the concrete walls. And my friend took the bucket of concrete and he painted on the wall, "Bob loves Baba," in giant 3-foot letters. And the head Sevadal from Hyderabad came through, and he was like appalled. And he was like, I'm sure he was terribly frightened that Swami was going to come in and see that, you know, these rowdy Westerners had printed graffiti all over his walls. But we immediately started painting it all over. And just when we finished painting it all over, who should come in but Sri Sathya Sai. And he looks at us, and then he looks at the Sevadal fellow, and he says about us, "Good boys." It was a moment. It was definitely a moment. And next slide, please. And again, just an example of updating. There are a number of past videos that need to be updated in format. And so this is a project in certain places. Next slide, please. And in Japan, there's sort of a cultural, there's a little bit of a cultural barrier to giving interviews because the people, in a sense, are very shy, very, very private, very quiet. And, you know, you don't rock the boat telling miracle stories and things like that. But we have a number of slides and interviews that people there gave. Next slide, please. And again, from around the world, this is an example from one from Africa, and a boy and his family, and they were, he was cured of his illness, and he continued to be able to play the lead in the drama. You see him in front of Swami there. And next slide, please. And this is a well-known devotee. You've all probably heard of Diana Baskin. Her mother was also very close to Swami. And Diana wrote several books before she passed away. The first one was called Divine Memories of Sathya Sai Baba. And she had many wonderful experiences, and some of them I had the great good fortune to overlap with. And so here she's writing about the Shivaratri in 1974. And to set the stage for it, let me tell you about the first Shivaratri I was at was 1972. And it was in Whitefield, the first time it had ever been in Whitefield. And just as Swami was about to give out the lingam, he rushed back inside to his house, and no one got to see it. And so people were very upset. And some had come from major distant thousands of miles to come to see. And there were, it put people through a lot of changes, shall we say, in the vernacular here. But then in 1973, Swami didn't do a public Shivaratri either. And he went off to the Bandipur forest in near Udakamand. And he took a few people with him, including Jack Hislop. And he, by the light of a flashlight on a riverbed, Swami materialized a Shiva lingam in 1973. And when Jack later, several years later, came back to New York to give a talk, he spoke about it. But what he mentioned was that a number of acquaintances of mine had followed along. In those days, it was not totally taboo to follow along, and you sort of followed at a distance, and if you were lucky, there might be an interaction with Swami, and you would have to watch very closely if Swami was giving you one of those fierce looks that might burn you to ash, or whether he was open and welcoming. And so what happened was, when the Shiva lingam was shown in 1974, a number of my friends were, you know, they were long-haired young Westerners. They were hiding in the bushes, watching all of this interaction, and they got to see the Shiva lingam being performed. And so when Jack came and spoke to the New York thing, he told about the Shiva lingam, and he said, and yes, there were these hippies hiding in the bushes watching. And afterwards, I had to tell him, Jack, I think you've insulted some of our oldest and most devoted members because there were a number of people there that had taken part in that. And there was always kind of a play with Swami, whether you were part of the group or whether you were a party crasher. And sometimes being a party crasher worked out extremely well. And sometimes being a party crasher worked out extremely badly. It was all part of that play at that time. So anyway, going on to Shivaratri of 1974, we watched as he materialized an unusual Jyoti lingam. Every 10 minutes, the lingam changed color. And so Swami the next morning gave a speech and he said, some of you saw red, some of you saw green, some of you saw blue, some saw yellow. You were all correct because inside this lingam is a rainbow that's revolving. And it's really quite a spectacular thing. It's, the solid object with a rainbow moving inside of it. And he also said in the speech, because he hadn't done the Shivaratri in a number of years, and very few people, relatively few people had come. It was enough to fill the Purnachandra, but it was relatively few for a Shivaratri. And I had the feeling he might do it. So I sort of, that evening, even though in the morning I had been sort of shuttled all the way to the very back wall of the Purnachandra, which is a long way away, in the evening, I sort of determined to get up as close as I could. And I got a very nice seat. And Swami showing the lingam. And then the next morning, he said, all of those who have seen this lingam, because it was so unusual and because so few had come, will not be reborn again. And the crowd went wild. The crowd loved it. I loved it. Everyone loved it. And but of course, these translations are always so rushed and hurried because Swami is speaking so fast, and there's very little time for the translator. And when it was published later, it said, all those who have seen this lingam and understood its significance will not be reborn. So that was a tough moment to see that, but it's all part of the humor and play of Sathya Sai, shall we say. Next slide, please. And again, just an example from work and archiving that's being done all over the world. This is from the Mideast region. Next slide, please. And this is something that was materialized not for a person, but for a country. This is pretty interesting, I think. This is towards the end of when Sathya Sai was in form. The Swami materialized this necklace for the devotees from Hungary. And afterwards, the devotees were so proud of it that they took it on a pilgrimage all over Hungary. And now it resides in the Budapest Center. And not only is it a wonderful story, but it sort of represents that some of these gifts from Swami are part of the national pride, part of the national story with Sathya Sai. And I'm sure in UK, you probably have things like that also. Next slide, please. And again, this is from a different traveling exhibit, but it shows some objects that were given by Sathya Sai, and they're being showcased. I believe this was in Poland at the time. And so it's a way of making these things live in people's hearts. They have a way of connecting people with Sathya Sai. Next slide, please. And again, I was talking about possibly housing gifts or objects from Sathya Sai. And here's an example of that. These were rings given to an officer in Brazil. And when he passed away, his wife has them, but she has no family or no devotees that seem to be the right people to pass them on to. And they're donating them to the archive to be shown as part of the Brazil archive. So again, it's just an example of what I wanted to mention along that. Next slide, please. So again, we're asking zonal chairs and national council presidents and officers to be on the lookout for what might be secure and accessible spaces. Clearly, if the center is renting a a hall that's probably not going to be a secure place, but there are many places that own buildings or have secure spots that might be a good place that would be able to show it to the devotees or to those that were interested. And so it's just a suggestion to be on the lookout for those kind of possibilities. Next slide, please. And this is an example from the Los Angeles area in the US, in Tustin. That's Elsie Cowan with Swami. And Swami really loved Elsie. He was always saying the most wonderful things about her. He said this center was the ideal center. And, you know, Elsie would come to see him. She came to see him once when she was 93. And Swami was sort of joking. He said, body's infirm, but heart is like a diamond. And this is just some things that Swami had given to people in the Los Angeles area, and the Tustin bookstore is able to showcase some of those items and some of those rare pictures. So it's just an example of something that's been done already. And next slide, please. And again, these are just examples where they've done the past history of the formation of the Sathya Sai International Organization in their country. And next slide, please. And this is just about interviewing people. Some of the challenges that happen. So sometimes people feel they can't remember and they need a little bit of help with sort of jogging their memory. Or sometimes they feel it's too personal, or they feel like their experience isn't big enough. Or maybe they feel that their experience is so big that it'll give them an inflated ego, whatever it is. But I'm suggesting that we should be past that by now. And this is about leaving, not about ourselves, but about leaving whatever it is that Sathya Sai gave to the future. And next slide, please. And so here are some of the ways that people who want to take part in archiving might be able to get around to it. And a couple of things here. In Australia, they did a number of interviews, many interviews with people, because some of them felt it was too much to try and tell their whole experience with Swami, but everyone agreed that they could tell how they came to Swami. And this is always, of course, a very, very interesting subject, and one that's often has heart-tugging kinds of implications to it. And so they've done that, and it's a way of getting to the tip of the iceberg, at least, before you dig deeper. Another way to overcome the challenges that we tried here in the US was to have some of the grandchildren, particularly if they were SSE students or whatever, interview the grandparents about their interaction with Sathya Sai. And it's something that has multiple benefits to it. And again, we suggest don't worry about the editing and all of that. That can all be taken care of later. The important thing is to get the memories before they vanish. Next slide, please. So again, I wanted to say that this is, Swami, it would say past is past. And just let go of the past, which is obviously perfect advice. However, when we listen to the stories of the Lord, the Leelas and Mahimas, they lead us to an eternal present. So these are something that can't be brushed off as, oh, well, that's past. It lives within us. And if we remember that, we become part of that present with God. Next slide, please. And I suggest that, with sealing on desires, we don't want to waste food. We don't want to waste money or energy or time or sound. We don't waste anything because it's all holy. It's all God. And even more precious is our memory of Sathya Sai, and in particular, these divine memories. And so right remembrance, we use our mind kind of as a junkyard, and it's got all kinds of useless stuff here that would be kind of useful to get rid of or to not pay so much attention to. And one way to be in what I'm calling right remembrance is to be remembering Sai, thinking about Sai, and hoping that these are some ways that we become closer to Sai or become further involved in his story, shall we say. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, by the way, that, yeah, no, go ahead, this is fine. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, this one, great. Okay. These quotes from Swami, I find personally very, very direct, very relevant to all of us. And I love it. It means that he's here just for us. That's why I have that photo there. Again, this is a photo taken by my brother-in-law in 1972. There was no color photography in India at the time, so you had to bring color film from the West. And in it, you see the young Sathya Sai. And you see, it's been cropped a little bit, but on the lower left, you see there's a hand reaching out to him. And obviously someone's very desperate and very keen on getting something from him. And it could be advice, it could be a healing, it could be whatever it is. And here's Sathya Sai, empty and joyous, open and just full-hearted with him. And this reminds me of an incident I saw in Whitefield in 1971. In those days, the town of Katagoti was about a quarter mile from the Whitefield campus. And there's an empty open field there. And there was a little bit of a barbed wire fence around the that backside of the campus, but it had been sort of tamped down and you could sort of step over it. And right in the middle of darshan, Swami's right in the middle of darshan, this fellow, he's with tears streaming down his face. He's taken his bike over that little fence and he's pedaling his bike right at Swami, straight at Swami. He's about 100 yards from Swami and he's pedaling towards Swami and he's crying and he's desperate. And the Sevadal are all kind of appalled and horrified. And they all jump up and they rush out to try and stop him. And he's dodging them. He's biking this way and that way. And finally, they tackle him just as he lands at Swami's feet. And the bike is sprawled and he's sprawled and he's crying and he's speaking to Swami. And Swami looks at him and Swami materializes some vibhuti for him. The fellow takes it and he hops on a bike, which is a little bit mangled by now, and he starts to ride away. When then he stops again, gets off the bike and rushes back to Swami and says something else to Swami. And Swami stops and materializes some more vibhuti for him. Then he gets on his bike and rides away, and we never hear or see from him again. So it's interesting what these interactions of people reaching out to Swami. They knew that the Swami, when all else fails, you have to go to Swami. And Swami saying, make use of me. That is all I ask of you. It rests with you how you make use of me. And you know, Swami said, what you get from the ocean depends on how big a pail you bring. You know, if you just bring this little cup, you just get a little cup's worth. If you bring a big pail, you know, you get quite a bit. And if you sort of open up some kind of canal to it, you get a lot. And so I'm suggesting that we all open up such a canal, such a channel to our heart. Next slide, please. And this is a series of from discourses, Summer Showers, and also Sai Speaks. And it's a sort of a, what I call a Zen approach to devotion. It's sort of Advaita, and in a sort of a mind-boggling way. It's sort of, I like the photo there, but I also like the quotes. I really can't say too much about them because it's probably above my spiritual pay grade, but I like this. Without devotee, there is no God. Devotees also create God. Man alone is endowed with this capacity to give and to form to God and to realize it. For the welfare of his devotees, God is prepared to give anything. Without devotees, where is God? Without devotees, where is Baba? Without Baba, where are the devotees? There is an unbreakable bond between Baba and his devotee. The two are inseparable and interdependent. Devotees are Baba's very life. Likewise, Baba is the very life of his devotees. This comes right to the heart of it, right to the heart of it. All the rest is just puff. All the rest is just a little bit of a flimsy little story. But the big story, the real story, this is our real story. Next slide, please. This is, if you want to contact us, you can do the email at top, and then there are other resources available. And next slide, please. And my favorite quote from the Gita, which I think describes us all. And with their minds wholly fixed on me, with their lives totally dedicated to me, mutually enlightening one another, and ever speaking of me, they feel contented and delighted indeed. Krishna says, and we believe because we've experienced. And let's let that flame get stronger and stronger and stronger. Next slide, please. And this is, I think, one of my favorite quotes, and I think it encapsulates a lot of what I've been trying to say here, is that what I call the power of the narrative. In other words, we all have this story we're running about ourselves. I'm such and such, or I'm a success, or I'm a failure, or this happened to me that shouldn't have happened, or this happened to me that I didn't deserve, or I did deserve, or the following, my life isn't complete without X, Y, or Z, or I'm a sinner, or I'm great, or it's all part of some narrative we tell ourselves. And particularly as a psychologist, I see people's narrative, and it's kind of interesting. But the narrative can be adjusted, shall we say, and nothing can adjust it more than Sathya Sai. And as a matter of fact, he goes right to the heart of it, and in this quote, I believe, says, "When you listen to my story, you forget the story of the world and live only in my story until there is no separate story for you to relate. To make you storyless is the purpose of my story." In other words, Swami has given us, he's had such an intense life, literally meeting millions of people. Like 1,000 people a day would show up, and he'd meet them one after another. Hundreds of people he would talk to and have interactions, and he would be the closest member of the whole family. And this was happening all over the world, and it was such a spectacular story. God incarnated in such a spectacular way. We know the Rama story, but for instance, Rama, this unbelievably powerful story that exists in great detail thousands of years later, but really few people knew Rama. And in Sathya Sai, we have the chance of literally millions of people had interactions with Sathya Sai, and it was a spectacular story that he gave us. And I'm trying to suggest to people to tell our Sai story is to be part of his story. And I think there can be nothing greater than that. I wanted to tell one last story. This is someone I had seen on the veranda in Puttaparthi, and must have been about 15, 20 years ago. And it's an Indian fellow, and he was writing. He was just writing. The rest of us were watching Swami do this or that, and we were waiting and hoping and praying and things. He was just writing as fast as one could write, and writing. And I noticed it, and someone pointed out to me, said, "This fellow has written the longest narrative poem in the history of the world." It was like he was on volume 55 at the time. I don't know how many volumes it went on for. It was some kind of world record. And it was obviously a type of automatic writing, because there wasn't even time to think. It was just pouring out of him. And I noticed that it was a spectacular thing to see, but even more so, I noticed that he had an amputated leg, and he'd had a severe case of diabetes. And so the doctors had told him that they would have to amputate the leg. My friend there told me that when they went to amputate his leg, he said, yes, you can take the leg, but you can't give me a general anesthetic because it can only be a local anesthetic because I'll need to keep writing. And so that's, to me, that's the example of someone that's so totally engrossed in his story that his body and everything else is just a sort of a demonstration from Swami of what that might be like. And let's see, next slide. Is there a next slide? Okay. So basically, unfortunately, I see in this format, I can't ask for questions or whatever. Let me just check on what the time is here. Okay, I think we're close to the time. So I just wanted to thank you all for giving me this opportunity. I pray that Swami blesses you all, particularly in this challenging time. I hope everyone stays healthy and happy and safe, and that if there's any lockdown happening, that we all use that as our monastery to be closer to Sathya Sai. And Jai Sai Ram, thank you very much. Om Sai Ram, may you all be well.
Jai Sai Ram, thank you so much, Dr. Gosselin. Such a wonderful presentation, very comprehensive, and a very important message that you give to all of us in the UK. And that is that we are simply custodians of Swami's life message of love all, serve all, and that these experiences are his way to involve us in his mission. We do hope you'll join us again in the near future. I particularly enjoyed the story that you shared about the healing lingam and the 20 years your dear friend had to wait, and how Swami involved him in self-inquiry. Wishing you a wonderful, happy Father's Day, and to everyone in the UK, Jai Sai Ram.